My name's Jake, and I've been a trucker for almost 20 years now. You'd think I'd seen it all out here on the road, and I thought I had too. Until I took that detour on Route 44. It was an old road I'd avoided most of my career, rumored among the community to be cursed or haunted or something like that. I'd usually laugh those stories off, but after that night, well, I'm not so sure. It was just past midnight when I found myself on Route 44. My usual highway was closed off due to an accident, and my GPS glitched, refusing to load any other routes. I was left with no choice but to take the detour. The road was quiet. Too quiet, even for midnight. Trees hugged each side, creating dark, winding tunnels illuminated only by my headlights, and there wasn't another car in sight. As I rounded a sharp curve, something flickered in the corner of my eye. A figure stood by the side of the road. My heart jumped. I'd been alone for miles. It was a man, drenched from head to toe, staring right at me as if he'd been waiting. I passed him quickly, my mind racing. Now I'm no stranger to the desperate folks who hitch rides in the dead of night. But this guy wasn't holding out his thumb, wasn't waving, wasn't moving at all. Just staring. I brushed it off as a trick of the light, kept driving, and tried to shake the image of his eyes, hollow and black in the glow of my headlights. A few minutes later, my radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Static hissed through the speakers before a low, barely audible voice whispered my name. Ja-Aki. My blood ran cold. The radio signal had been dead since I hit Route 44. No stations, no emergency alerts, nothing. I fiddled with the dial, but the voice just got louder, more insistent. Turn back, Jake. My grip tightened on the wheel. Maybe it was just exhaustion messing with me. I hadn't slept properly in days, and this was my third haul this week. Yeah, that had to be it. But then I saw him again. The hitchhiker was ahead of me now, standing in the middle of the road this time. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a halt inches away from him. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just kept staring with those empty eyes, rain dripping off his face. For a moment he looked almost familiar, like a face I'd seen in a dream but couldn't place. I honked the horn, but he didn't budge. And when I blinked, he was gone. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel something in the truck with me, a heaviness pressing down on my shoulders, chilling the air. I told myself I was just spooked, paranoid from too many ghost stories shared at late-night stops. But then the smell hit me. It was sharp, metallic, like blood. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, sitting in the passenger seat, drenched and still as death. He whispered again, low and cold, right into my ear. You shouldn't have taken this road, Jake. Panicking, I stomped on the gas. The truck roared down the road, engine straining as I sped, hoping to shake off whatever was haunting me. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare check the passenger seat again. I could feel his presence, feel those empty eyes boring into the side of my face. After what felt like hours, the GPS blinked back to life, directing me to an exit off Route 44. I took it, not caring where it led, just desperate to get away. As I merged onto the familiar interstate, the smell vanished, the air warmed, and when I finally gathered the courage to look, the passenger seat was empty. I pulled into a rest stop a few miles down and sat there, shaking, trying to process what just happened. The truck was silent, and everything seemed normal. Just another quiet night on the road. But as I turned off the engine, something caught my eye. Water was dripping onto the passenger seat, forming a small dark puddle that smelled faintly of blood. Since that night, I haven't taken Route 44 again. I never told anyone else about the hitchhiker. I'd sound crazy, even to other drivers. But sometimes, when the road is too quiet and the night too dark, I swear I can still smell that metallic tang, feel the weight of his eyes watching me, waiting for the next poor soul to take that cursed road. The name's Bill. and I've been driving big rigs coast to coast for over 15 years. I've seen all kinds of crazy things out there on the road, things that'd make most folks turn tail and find a different line of work. But there's one night I'll never forget, a night that still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. It happened somewhere along Route 177, deep in the desert, with miles of empty land on either side. A route known for strange sightings and radio interference. I was halfway through a long haul, delivering goods from Arizona to Nevada, when I found myself on 177 alone. It was around 2 a.m., and I was looking forward to the next rest stop, maybe grabbing a coffee or stretching my legs. The night was quiet, too quiet, except for the low hum of the CB radio crackling every so often. I'd tuned into Channel 19 as usual, but there was barely a whisper on the air. Suddenly, through the static, I heard someone say my name. Bill. The voice was low and drawn out, barely above a whisper. I stiffened, leaning toward the radio, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. Bill, you out there? I picked up the mic, heart pounding. Yeah, I'm here. Who's calling? Silence. Just static, hissing softly through the speakers. I shook my head, chalking it up to a prank. Maybe another driver was trying to mess with me. It wasn't unheard of on long night drives, especially out in the middle of nowhere. I was about to switch channels when the voice came through again, a little louder this time. Bill, you shouldn't have taken this route tonight. I froze. Whoever it was, they knew my name. My mind was racing now, trying to figure out who it could be. No one knew my route except the dispatcher, and they sure as hell wouldn't be pulling this kind of prank. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my cool. Who is this? I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. How do you know my name? Silence again. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I felt an icy chill creep down my spine. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the darkness pressing in on either side. My headlights barely cut through the night, casting long, ghostly shadows over the pavement. I kept my eyes on the road, but every few seconds, I'd glance at the CB radio, half expecting that voice to break the silence again. And then it did. Bill, she's waiting for you. A shiver ran down my spine. I looked around the cab, half expecting to see someone sitting in the seat beside me, but there was nothing. Just the empty, eerie quiet of the desert night. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, and I focused on breathing steadily, telling myself it was just a prank. A damn good one, but a prank all the same. I took a deep breath and switched channels, figuring I'd leave Channel 19 behind. I tuned in to Channel 22, hoping for a distraction. Maybe another driver would be on the air, chatting about the weather or road conditions. But instead, I heard a voice. Soft, cold, and unmistakable. You can't hide, Bill. I nearly jumped out of my seat, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. My hands were slick with sweat now, and I kept glancing at the passenger seat, the mirrors, the empty stretch of road behind me. There was no one there. Just shadows and the occasional tumbleweed rolling across the asphalt. Then, through the rearview mirror, I saw something. At first, it looked like headlights far in the distance, bouncing and flickering like an old beaten-down truck. But as I watched, those lights grew brighter, moving faster than any truck had a right to out there on Route 177. I sped up, my engine groaning under the pressure, but those lights kept closing in. Bill, you can't outrun her. The voice was back, louder this time, almost laughing, like it knew something I didn't. My heart was racing, and I could feel panic rising in my chest. I didn't know who or what she was, but I had no intention of sticking around to find out. I floored the gas pedal, my truck barreling down the road, tires screeching as I took a curve too fast. I glanced in the mirror, hoping those lights were gone, but they were closer now, nearly on top of me. I couldn't see the vehicle itself, just those blinding, relentless lights like twin eyes burning through the darkness. Just when I thought the lights would slam into me, they vanished. I hit the brakes, the truck lurching forward as I struggled to regain control. I stopped in the middle of the road, breathing hard, trying to calm my pounding heart. The desert was quiet again, the radio silent, as if nothing had happened. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, my mind reeling. And then, slowly, the radio crackled back to life. "Bill, she's closer than you think." I felt a presence behind me, something cold and dark, filling the cab like a shadow. I didn't dare turn around. My hands shook as I reached for the ignition, praying the engine would start, that I could outrun whatever was haunting me on this God-forsaken road. But just as I twisted the key, I heard a whisper, right next to my ear, a voice I'll never forget. "Bill, she's waiting for you, at the next stop." The truck roared to life, and I sped down Route 177, refusing to look back. I kept driving until I reached the city lights, safe among the neon signs and traffic. But even now, when I'm out on those empty stretches, I swear I can hear her voice over the radio, whispering my name, waiting. My name is Terry. I'm a seasoned trucker who's traveled through every stretch of highway you can imagine, from coast to coast and border to border. There's comfort in the solitude of the open road, in the hours where it's just you, the truck, and the rumble of asphalt beneath your wheels. But one night, not long ago, that solitude turned on me in a way I'll never forget. It was about 3 a.m., the witching hour, as they say. I was driving through a remote part of New Mexico on Route 285, a desolate stretch where gas stations and pit stops are few and far between. The only light came from my high beams cutting through the dark and the faint glow of a sliver moon hanging low in the sky. I'd been driving nonstop for hours and knew I needed a break. I was already pushing my limits, eyes heavy and nerves on edge from exhaustion. As if on cue, a small gas station appeared out of nowhere on the right side of the road, an old relic with a neon sign that flickered dimly. "Last stop before nowhere." I almost laughed at the sign. Seemed like the type of dark joke you'd expect in a horror movie. But when you're as tired as I was, any break is a welcome one. I pulled in, the gravel crunching under my wheels, and parked next to an old rusted pickup that looked like it hadn't moved in years. The gas station itself was quiet, the lights inside barely illuminating the rows of dusty shelves. I stepped out of my truck, stretched, and headed toward the door, noticing a strange silence that seemed to swallow every sound. Even the wind was still. As I walked through the door, a faint bell chimed, echoing unnaturally in the emptiness. Behind the counter sat an older man, skin pale and eyes hollow, as if he hadn't seen daylight in years. He nodded slightly as I entered, eyes tracking me in a way that made my skin crawl. "Evening," I mumbled, trying to shake off the weird vibes. I grabbed a coffee from the pot near the counter, noticing it was unusually cold. I took a sip anyway, grimacing at the taste, but hoping the caffeine would help me push through the rest of my drive. "That's a long road you're on," the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Especially at this hour." I shrugged, trying to keep it casual. "Yeah, well, that's the job, right?" He didn't answer, just gave a slow, eerie smile that showed too many teeth. I set my coffee down, suddenly uneasy. I wasn't one to be spooked easily, but there was something about him, something that felt wrong, like he didn't quite belong in this world. As I turned to leave, he called out after me, "Watch out for the one on the road tonight." I paused, looking back. "The one?" He didn't answer, just watched me with those hollow eyes as I walked out. I shook off the encounter, chalking it up to a creepy old man trying to mess with the tired trucker. I climbed back into my rig, turned the key, and pulled out of the station, eager to leave it behind. The highway was as empty as ever, stretching into the darkness with no end in sight. But after a few miles, I felt an itch at the back of my neck, the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced in the side mirror, half expecting to see headlights, but there was nothing, just blackness swallowing the road behind me. And then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching as I fought to stop in time. I could see the figure more clearly now, a woman in a tattered dress, her hair hanging over her face, standing perfectly still. My heart pounded as I came to a halt, barely inches from her. I leaned out the window shouting, "Hey, are you okay?" She didn't respond. She didn't move. She just stood there, head tilted, as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. I grabbed my flashlight, hesitating for a moment before stepping out of the truck, my feet hitting the asphalt with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. "Ma'am, do you need help?" I asked, shining the light toward her. She looked up then, her eyes meeting mine, and I felt a chill go straight to my bones. Her face was pale, her eyes vacant, staring through me like I wasn't even there. And then, as if she were a mirage, she vanished, gone, leaving nothing but the cold, empty night. I stumbled back, heart racing, and climbed into my truck, slamming the door. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, convincing myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. But as I shifted into gear and started driving again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A few miles later, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Last stop before nowhere." A faint voice whispered through the static, followed by an unsettling, hollow laugh. I gripped the wheel tighter, refusing to look in the rearview mirror, refusing to acknowledge the faint shadow that seemed to hover in the back seat, just at the edge of my vision. I kept driving, faster and faster, as if I could outrun whatever was haunting me. By the time I reached the next town, dawn was breaking, and the nightmare of that night faded in the light of day. I stopped at a diner, trying to shake off the chills still clinging to me. The waitress poured me a coffee, giving me a strange look when I asked if she'd heard of the gas station on Route 285. "Honey, there hasn't been a gas station on that road for over 30 years, she said, shaking her head. "Burned down in a fire back in the 70s. Everyone who worked there died." I left that diner in a hurry, hands shaking as I climbed back into my rig. I haven't taken Route 285 since. But sometimes, when I'm out on those empty roads at night, I see her, standing in the distance, waiting, like she's just biding her time until the next poor soul stops for gas. The name's Wes, and I've been driving long haul for a good 12 years now. I've had my share of eerie nights on the road, but there's one night that stands out. A night I try not to think about because it chills me to the bone even now. It happened along an isolated stretch of highway in West Virginia, somewhere between the mountains and the fog. It's a route known for sharp turns, steep inclines, and long winding miles where you rarely see another soul. I was halfway through my trip, hauling a load up north, and it was around midnight. My radio had been acting up all night, the static somehow thicker than usual, cutting in and out in short, abrupt bursts. Just as I was considering pulling over to check my equipment, a sign came into view. It was an old, rusted mile marker covered in grime, with only the numbers 13.5 visible through the muck. As I passed it, the radio went silent. A deep, eerie silence that was even worse than the static. I felt a shiver run down my spine but shrugged it off, trying to keep my mind on the road. But then, I saw something strange in my mirrors. Behind me, just at the edge of my taillights, there was a shadow. I kept glancing back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. At first it was faint, like something was following me at a distance, but every few seconds it seemed to get closer, moving silently up the road without any sign of headlights or engine noise. I thought maybe I was just tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, the shadow was almost right behind my truck. It had no distinct form, just a dark, inky mass that seemed to stretch and twist, like smoke caught in the headlights. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse racing, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. I let out a shaky breath, feeling ridiculous for letting a trick of the light get to me. I was just tired, that's all. I reached for my coffee and took a long gulp, hoping the caffeine would clear my head. But as I passed mile marker 14, the radio crackled back to life. A voice cut through the static, soft and slow, like someone whispering in my ear. "You shouldn't have passed that marker." I nearly dropped my coffee. The voice was low, distorted, almost otherworldly. I grabbed the radio, my hands shaking. "Hello? Who is this?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. There was no answer, just that same eerie silence. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just a prank, someone messing around on the frequency, trying to freak out late-night drivers. But deep down, I didn't believe it. There was something about that voice, something cold and empty that made my skin crawl. I kept driving, the road winding through the darkness, mile markers ticking by. But as I approached marker 15, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing by the side of the road was a figure, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, like something out of a century-old photograph. He didn't move as I passed, didn't raise his hand to signal for help or show any sign of life. He just stood there staring, his face hidden in shadow. I sped up, heart racing, refusing to look back. But as I glanced in the mirror, I saw him again, this time standing in the middle of the road behind me, getting smaller as I drove away. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the lines of the road, counting the mile markers to calm myself. But the further I drove, the stronger the feeling of dread became. A creeping sense that I was being watched, that something was following me, closing in. Then, just as I approached mile marker 16, my engine sputtered. The truck lurched, shuddering like it was struggling to keep going. I glanced at the fuel gauge, but it was fine. I'd filled up not long before the trip, so there was no reason for it to fail. The radio crackled again, that same cold voice whispering through the static. "Turn back, Wes, before it's too late." A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. The voice had used my name. I hadn't told anyone my name that night, hadn't spoken to anyone since I left the last town miles back. I didn't even respond this time. I just focused on getting through that stretch, ignoring the voices, ignoring the shadow that now seemed to flicker at the edge of my headlights. Finally, I saw a sign for a rest stop up ahead. My heart leapt. I didn't care if it was run down, didn't care if it was just an empty lot as long as it meant getting off that road. I pulled in, the truck wheezing as it came to a stop, and shut off the engine. For a moment I just sat there trying to steady my breathing, to convince myself it was all in my head. But as I glanced out the window, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, standing by mile marker 16, was the man with the wide-brimmed hat, staring directly at me. His face was still hidden, but somehow I knew he was smiling, knew that he was waiting for me to pass by that marker again. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in that rest stop, engine idling, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I pulled out onto the highway, avoiding Route 285 altogether, taking the long way home. And I've never driven that stretch again. But sometimes, when I'm on those empty roads, I swear I see him out of the corner of my eye, waiting by the mile markers, waiting for me to pass. I'm Sam, and I've been driving trucks for over 20 years, hauling everything from livestock to furniture across thousands of miles. Life on the road becomes second nature after a while. You get used to the emptiness, the silence, the way the landscape blurs into one long, endless stretch. But one night, a stretch of road taught me a lesson I'll never forget. A night that still haunts me every time I'm behind the wheel. It started like any other late-night haul. I was driving through the Great Plains, somewhere in Nebraska, with nothing but flat fields on either side and a sky full of stars above. My GPS had been acting up all night, glitching and rerouting, showing no towns or landmarks anywhere close by. But I didn't think much of it. Technical problems happen. Besides, I had the route memorized. Or so I thought. Around 2 a.m., something strange happened. The road in front of me suddenly curved sharply to the right, leading into an area I didn't recognize. I knew these routes like the back of my hand and was certain there shouldn't be any turns for another 50 miles. But somehow, the road stretched out before me, winding off into the distance, swallowed by the darkness. A chill crept down my spine, but I kept driving, hoping it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But as the miles rolled on, I noticed something unsettling. The same landmarks began to appear on the side of the road. A lone tree with twisted branches, an old rusted road sign that I couldn't quite read, and a broken-down car, abandoned and half-buried in the dirt. Each time I passed them, they looked exactly the same, like they hadn't moved an inch. After the third time, I felt my pulse quicken. I checked my GPS, hoping it would help me figure out where I was, but the screen had gone completely black, as if it had died. I was stuck in a loop, the same stretch of road repeating itself, and no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't seem to get anywhere. As I passed the twisted tree for the fourth time, the CB radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Sam," a voice whispered, low and raspy, barely more than a breath. "You're not supposed to be here." My heart pounded. I hadn't touched the radio, hadn't heard a single transmission for hours, and yet, someone out there knew my name. Who is this?" I stammered, my voice sounding foreign in the quiet cab. The radio was silent for a moment, and then the voice came again, a little louder this time, echoing through the static. "Turn back, before it's too late." I gripped the wheel, knuckles white, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was a prank, someone messing around on the frequency. But as I drove on, the road began to change. The sky grew darker, the stars disappearing one by one until there was nothing but blackness above me. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my shoulders, making it hard to breathe. And then I saw something ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. It was a man, dressed in old, dusty clothes, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He raised a hand, as if to wave me down, but there was something wrong about him, something that made every instinct in my body scream to stay away. I swerved, pulling the truck to the other side of the road and kept driving. As I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road, watching me with a blank, expressionless stare. And then, just like the landmarks, he reappeared ahead of me, waiting by the side of the road as if he'd never moved. Every time I tried to avoid him, he'd show up again, standing closer, his hand slowly reaching out as if beckoning me to stop. By the fifth time, he was so close that I could see his face, or what was left of it. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his skull, and his eyes were empty, hollow, like someone had scooped them out. I could feel those empty sockets staring into me, piercing through the cab. I pushed the pedal to the floor, desperate to get away. The truck roared forward, the engine straining as I sped through the darkness. But no matter how fast I went, the landmarks kept looping. The tree, the sign, the broken car, and then the man with the hollow eyes. The radio crackled again, the same voice whispering through the static, almost pleading. "Sam, stop running." I slammed my fist against the radio, trying to shut it off, but the voice only grew louder. "Turn back, before it's too late." And then, for the first time, I noticed the odometer. The numbers were frozen, stuck on 666, even though I knew I'd driven miles past that point. My stomach twisted as I realized that I was trapped, caught in some kind of nightmare loop with no way out. I didn't know what else to do, so I started talking to him. The man on the radio. Whatever he was. "I'm just trying to get home," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please let me go." There was a long silence, the static hissing like a warning. And then finally, the voice spoke again, soft and cold. "There's no way home from here." In that moment, I knew that I'd stumbled into something beyond understanding, something that had no intention of letting me leave. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, fighting the urge to scream, to cry, to do anything that might break this terrible spell. But then, just as I was about to give up hope, I saw a light in the distance, a single, blinding point that cut through the darkness like a beacon. I aimed for it, pushing the truck harder, ignoring the twisted tree, the broken car, and the man who now stood directly in my path. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact, and felt a jolt as the truck passed through him, the cab flooding with a freezing cold that bit into my skin, my bones. But when I opened my eyes again, the road was empty, the light growing brighter as I drove toward it. Moments later, I emerged onto the familiar highway, the endless loop breaking as the dawn rose over the horizon. The road was clear, the landmarks gone, and the voice on the radio was silent. I pulled into the nearest truck stop, hands shaking, and swore I'd never take that route again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm out on the open road, I still hear him, the man with the hollow eyes, whispering through the static, waiting to pull me back to that endless road to nowhere. My name's Mike, and I've been a trucker since I was old enough to get my license. I've hauled just about every kind of load you can think of across this country, through rainstorms, snow, and pitch-black nights. I always thought nothing could faze me. But a few years ago, I ended up in the strangest, most unsettling experience of my life. A night I still can't explain, even to myself. It was close to midnight on a stretch of road somewhere deep in Utah. The landscape was barren, nothing but stretches of desert with a few scraggly bushes under the faint glow of the moon. I was tired, pushing through a long haul to meet a delivery deadline, with hours left to go, and not a gas station in sight. I was just settling into the steady rhythm of the drive when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. They appeared out of nowhere, closing in fast. But just when I thought the vehicle would overtake me, it slowed down, falling into pace right behind my truck. I couldn't make out the make or model. It was just a dark silhouette with headlights glaring through the rear window. I shrugged it off. Just another night driver, probably in the same situation as me. But then another set of lights appeared behind him. And then another. Within minutes, I was part of a convoy of vehicles, all keeping the same distance, headlights blazing in my mirrors. I tried to wave them ahead, slowing down a bit to let them pass. But they just stayed there, never speeding up, never slowing down, their lights reflecting off my side mirrors, filling the cab with an eerie glow. I picked up my CB radio, hoping maybe one of them would respond if I called out. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Mike. Anyone in the convoy want to identify?" Silence. Just static on the other end, hissing softly through the speakers. "Come on, fellas, you're crowding my mirrors," I muttered, trying to keep my tone light. But no one responded. I couldn't even see the drivers, just dark silhouettes barely visible through the glare of their own lights. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but they matched my pace perfectly. My truck was practically at full throttle, barreling down the road, but they kept right behind me, as if we were all tethered together. Then, I started to notice something strange about the road. I'd been driving for hours, but I didn't recognize anything around me. Not the landscape, not the road signs. It was as if I'd been driving in circles, passing the same stretch of desert again and again, with no end in sight. The CB crackled to life suddenly, a low, distorted voice coming through the static. "Stay in line, Mike. Don't fall behind." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't said my name over the radio, hadn't identified myself at all. But whoever or whatever was speaking knew exactly who I was. I gripped the wheel, staring straight ahead, refusing to look in the mirrors, convinced that if I turned around, I'd see something I couldn't handle. The voice came again, softer this time, almost a whisper. "Don't break formation, Mike. You won't like what happens if you do." A chill crept down my spine, but I was too far in now, too deep into whatever this convoy was. I thought about pulling over, maybe letting them pass. But something told me that stopping was the worst thing I could do. So I kept driving, feeling the weight of their headlights pressing against my back. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint glow on the horizon, a sign maybe, or a gas station. I focused on it, hoping that whatever weirdness I was caught in would end if I could just reach that light. But as I drove closer, I realized the light wasn't a gas station or a sign. It was a graveyard of wrecked vehicles, all lined up in neat rows on either side of the road. Old, rusted-out cars, trucks, and motorcycles, their windows shattered, doors hanging open as if they'd been abandoned for years. And in the middle of the wreckage, sitting as silent as a tombstone, was a truck identical to mine. Down to the same model and color, with the same call sign scrawled across the side. Big Mike. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. My truck screeched to a halt, skidding to a stop right in front of the doppelganger. I stared at it, unable to believe what I was seeing. The convoy behind me stopped, their lights dimming, casting strange, shifting shadows over the wreckage. I grabbed the CB, trying to contact anyone, but it was just dead static now, a wall of silence pressing in from every side. I looked in the mirrors, hoping for some explanation, but there was no one behind me anymore. Just empty road stretching back into darkness. A sound broke the silence, faint at first but growing louder. A slow, rhythmic scraping, like metal dragging against pavement. I turned back to the wreckage, heart pounding, and saw something moving inside the cab of my twin truck. A figure climbed out, tall and thin, its face obscured in shadow. It looked like a man, but there was something off about it, something that made my stomach twist with dread. The figure stepped forward, dragging one leg as if it were broken, moving slowly, deliberately, in my direction. Without thinking, I threw the truck into reverse, my tires squealing as I backed away. The figure kept coming, one hand outstretched, reaching toward me with fingers that looked far too long, far too thin. I shifted gears, flooring the gas, tearing down the road in the opposite direction, refusing to look back. The CB crackled one last time, that same whispering voice echoing through the cab. "You can't outrun us, Mike. You're part of the convoy now." I sped through the night, desperate to escape, but no matter how far I drove, I could feel them behind me, their headlights flickering at the edge of my vision, waiting for me to fall behind. By the time dawn broke, the road had returned to normal, the strange convoy gone, the graveyard of wreckage nowhere in sight. But every time I'm out on those lonely highways, I keep an eye on my mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights again, to hear that voice on the radio, reminding me that I'm part of the convoy, whether I like it or not. My name's Earl, and I've been a trucker for close to 30 years. I've spent more nights on the road than I can count, seen every strange thing you could imagine and probably a few you couldn't. But the night I saw her, well, that was something else entirely. It was a stormy night somewhere in Oregon, with rain pouring so hard that my wipers could barely keep up. The highway was empty, and the visibility was almost nothing. Just sheets of rain and the occasional flash of lightning that made the shadows dance along the side of the road. I was making good time, hoping to find a rest stop soon, when I saw her, a figure standing by the side of the road, soaked to the bone, one arm raised as if to wave me down. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, something that looked like it was from another time, the fabric clinging to her in the rain. Her hair was plastered to her face, hiding her eyes. Something told me to keep driving, that picking up a stranger in the middle of nowhere was a bad idea. But she looked so helpless standing there, and the rain was coming down harder by the minute. I figured maybe her car had broken down, that she needed help. I pulled over, rolling down the window just enough to shout through the rain. "You okay, miss? Need a ride?" She didn't answer, just nodded slowly, her face still hidden by her drenched hair. I hesitated, feeling a strange sense of unease, but then I unlocked the door. She climbed in without a word, settling into the passenger seat, her head tilted down so that I couldn't see her face. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound friendly, even though every instinct was telling me something was wrong. She didn't respond, just stared at her hands, which were pale and almost translucent. I brushed it off as a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the chill that crept up my spine. As I started driving again, the cab filled with an intense, icy cold. I cranked up the heat, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The rain beat against the windshield, louder than ever, and the silence between us was thick, heavy, like something waiting to be broken. Finally, I tried again. "Where are you headed, miss?" This time she spoke, her voice low and soft, barely audible over the rain. "Home." There was something in the way she said it, something that sent a shiver down my spine. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel a little tighter, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. We drove in silence for a while, and I began to notice that the rain seemed to be letting up. The road ahead was clear, and the storm was already starting to fade into the distance. I glanced over at her, about to say something but stopped cold. She was looking right at me, her face finally visible, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Her skin was deathly pale, almost gray, and her eyes were hollow, empty, like deep, black pits that seemed to go on forever. I gasped, jerking the wheel slightly, but somehow managed to keep control of the truck. She smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't reach those empty eyes. "You're going the wrong way." My heart pounded as I tried to stay calm, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "I'm just driving along the highway, ma'am," I said, voice shaking. "There's no wrong way on a straight road." She shook her head, that sad smile never leaving her face. "There's always a wrong way," she whispered, "and you've taken it." I didn't know what she meant, but something told me not to ask. I kept driving, praying that I'd reach a town soon or a gas station or anything that would get me out of that truck. But as the miles rolled on, I realized I hadn't seen another car, another sign, not even a turnoff. The road stretched endlessly, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I glanced at the clock, and a chill ran through me. It hadn't changed. It still read 2:17 a.m., the same time it had been when I picked her up. I checked my watch, but the hands were frozen, locked in place as if time itself had stopped. She was watching me, her hollow eyes unblinking, a faint smile still on her lips. "Where are we?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "On the way," she said softly, "to where you're meant to go." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment I felt like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to stop the truck, to get out and run, but some force kept me glued to my seat, kept my hands on the wheel. I was trapped, and I knew it. Suddenly, the road began to change. The pavement grew rougher, cracked, with weeds sprouting through the gaps, and the trees on either side seemed to twist and contort, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The headlights barely cut through the thickening fog, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I glanced over at her again, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, but the cold lingered, an oppressive chill that settled in my bones. I could still feel her presence, like she was watching from just out of sight, waiting. Panicked, I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt on the cracked pavement. I sat there, breathing hard, my hands shaking as I stared at the empty seat. "Where did you go?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. A soft voice echoed from the darkness, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "I'm always here, Earl, waiting for those who take the wrong way." The fog began to clear, and as it did, I saw the road ahead split into two paths, one leading back to the familiar highway, and the other veering off into the dark unknown. I didn't hesitate. I chose the familiar road, tearing down the highway as fast as I could, not daring to look back. When I finally saw the lights of a gas station on the horizon, I felt a wave of relief so intense I almost cried. I pulled in, parking the truck and stumbling out, desperate to feel solid ground beneath my feet. The clerk gave me a strange look as I walked in, drenched in sweat despite the cold night air. "Rough night?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded, too shaken to speak, just grateful to be back among the living. "I haven't taken that road since, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, on stormy nights, when I'm driving through unfamiliar stretches of road, I catch a glimpse of her in my mirrors, a woman standing by the side of the road, soaked to the bone, with empty eyes and a sad, knowing smile, waiting for the next driver who'll take the wrong way." My name's Joe, and I've spent the better part of my life on the road, driving hauls through every corner of the country. I've gotten used to the loneliness, the strange hours, and the long stretches where it's just me and the endless highway. I've even grown to enjoy the eerie calm of night driving. But one night, about 3 years back, I found myself on a road that felt different, a road that I can still feel in my bones whenever I think about it. It was an unusually quiet night somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd taken an older route to avoid some construction delays, a stretch of road I'd never driven before. The road was narrow, winding through dense trees, with no lights except my own headlights and the dim glow of the dashboard. The radio was silent, nothing but static, so I turned it off and settled into the drive, letting the quiet of the night wrap around me. A fog started to roll in, thick and heavy, obscuring the road ahead. I slowed down, peering through the haze, barely able to see more than a few feet in front of me. That's when I saw him. A figure up ahead, standing on the side of the road, holding an old-fashioned lantern that cast a faint golden glow. He was dressed in ragged clothes, something that looked like it belonged in another century, and his head was bowed, hiding his face. The sight of him sent a chill down my spine, but I told myself he was probably just a hiker who'd gotten lost or stranded. Still, something didn't sit right. Who in their right mind would be out here in the middle of the night, on a foggy road with nothing but a lantern? I slowed to a crawl, considering whether to stop or drive past. But as I got closer, he looked up, his face shadowed under the brim of a worn hat. He didn't wave or signal for help. He just watched me, eyes following my every move, his expression unreadable. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window, just enough to speak over the low hum of the engine. "Need any help, buddy?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the thick silence. He just stared, unblinking, his gaze fixed on me. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he said, "It's a long way back." I frowned, not sure what he meant. "You lost or something?" He didn't answer, didn't move. The lantern in his hand swung gently, casting shadows that seemed to shift and dance across his face. I felt a strange urge to look away, but something kept me frozen, caught in his gaze. And then he took a step toward the truck, his face still hidden in shadow. I didn't know why, but every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from him as possible. My hand shot to the gear shift, and I started to ease off the brake, inching forward. He spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost sad. "It's a long way back, Joe." My blood ran cold. I hadn't told him my name. I'd barely even spoken to him, and there was no way he could have known me. My heart pounded, and I felt sweat trickle down my neck despite the chill in the air. I looked ahead, trying to ignore him, but as I drove, the fog thickened, swallowing the road until I could barely see the edge of my headlights. I glanced in the mirror, half expecting him to be standing there, but the road behind me was empty. Just darkness and swirling fog. I took a shaky breath, trying to shake off the encounter, but the words kept echoing in my mind. "It's a long way back." I drove for what felt like hours, but the road didn't change. It was just mile after mile of twisted, winding asphalt, with no landmarks, no signs, nothing to indicate I'd made any progress. I felt a growing sense of dread, like I was driving in circles, like I'd never find my way out. Then, through the fog, I saw a dim light up ahead. My pulse quickened. Maybe it was a house or a gas station, somewhere I could get my bearings. But as I got closer, my heart sank. It wasn't a house. It was him, the man with the lantern, standing by the side of the road, watching me with those same hollow eyes. I hit the gas, speeding past him, refusing to look back. The fog thickened, the road twisting beneath my wheels, and every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of that lantern in the distance, flickering in the haze, always just ahead, always watching. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. I grabbed the CB, hoping maybe another driver was out there, that someone could tell me how to get off this road. "Breaker, breaker, anyone out there? I need some directions. I think I'm lost." I stammered, my voice shaking. For a moment there was only static, and then, through the crackling noise, I heard a voice. But it wasn't a stranger's voice. It was him. "It's a long way back, Joe." I dropped the mic, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. I didn't know what else to do, so I started driving again, pushing the truck as fast as I dared, desperate to leave that cursed road behind. The fog began to clear, and for a moment, I thought maybe I'd escaped. The road straightened, the trees thinning out, and I felt a flicker of hope. But as I rounded a bend, I saw him again, standing in the middle of the road, the lantern casting shadows that seemed to reach out, grasping at the edges of the light. I skidded to a stop, my heart racing. He took a step toward the truck, his face still hidden, and raised the lantern, casting a dim, eerie glow over the cab. "Turn back, Joe," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's a long way back, but it's the only way out." I don't know why, but something in his tone, something in the weight of those words, told me he was telling the truth. With a shaky breath, I put the truck in reverse, backing away from him, watching as he faded into the fog. I drove backwards for what felt like an eternity, my eyes fixed on the road behind me, heart pounding with every turn. Finally, the fog lifted completely, and I found myself on a familiar stretch of highway, miles from where I'd started. I pulled into the nearest truck stop, hands shaking as I climbed out of the cab. I haven't taken that route since. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I catch a glimpse of a lantern in the distance, a faint light flickering through the fog, waiting. And every time I hear his voice, a whisper in the back of my mind. It's a long way back.